Good morning and welcome to this webinar. Today we'll explain our independent forecasts of the Scottish economy, taxes and social security spending that we published last week alongside the budget. I'm David Alf, one of the commissioners, and I'm joined by Francis Breeden, a fellow commissioner, by Claire Murdoch, our head of social security and public funding, and by David Stone, who heads up our economy and tax work. Our chair, Dame Susan Rice, and our fourth commissioner, Professor Alistair Smith, are unable to join us today. Before I hand over to Francis to talk through our report in detail, I'll mention some of the highlights. After Francis has finished his presentation, we'll move on to questions and answers. We're collecting the questions through an app called Slido. You can either ask your own questions or upvote questions from others that you would like to hear answered at slido.com using the code #431441. The more popular is a question, the earlier it will be addressed by the panel. But don't worry if you didn't get the web address and the code number. These will be on the bottom of the slides throughout the talk. So feel free to submit any question as it occurs to you in the course of the presentation. Finally, to make you aware, this event is being recorded via Teams for distribution later. So let me turn now to our report and our forecasts. On the economy, we continue to expect a strong recovery, with Scottish GDP growing by 10.4% this financial year. We'll return to pre-pandemic levels of economic activity by the second quarter of 2022. Despite the more positive outlook for the economy, the fiscal picture is looking more mixed. Last week, the Finance Secretary presented her first budget of the new Parliament alongside the medium-term financial strategy for the next 5 years. So the Commission has been thinking hard about the resources likely to be available to the Scottish Government over the remaining years of this Parliament. The Scottish Government's income is largely driven by the spending decisions of the UK Government via a block grant. Nevertheless, the Scottish Government's tax policies and their social security commitments play an important part in determining the overall budget. We're forecasting downward pressure on the budget from tax, particularly income tax. This is because income tax revenue in Scotland is growing more slowly than in the rest of the UK, and under devolution, Scotland's per capita share of UK revenue is netted off from the revenue raised in Scotland. As a consequence, the net position becomes increasingly negative over the 5 years. At the same time, there will be a significant increase in social security spending as a result of the new policies and reforms to existing policies that are being introduced by the Scottish Government. And all of this additional spending has to be met out of the Scottish budget, which exerts a further increasingly negative pressure on it. Overall, we expect the Scottish budget to increase by 10% in nominal terms over the next 5 years, but after adjusting for inflation, that increase is just 1%. So in summary, many challenges for the government in managing its budget over both the next year and the following 4 years. I'm now going to hand over to Francis, who will take you through the forecast in more detail. And after that, we'll try to answer as many of your questions as we can before we finish at 12 o'clock. Over to you, Francis.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so what I'll do, I'll go through some slides and that will take the questions at the end. So let me bring these slides up. Okay, so before I go into the details, a reminder of what David said about Slido. So the questions are going through that website. So if you go to Slido, and then the code is hash 431441. And as David said, even if you're not planning to actually ask a question yourself, one of the features of Slido is that you can like a question that somebody else has asked, and that obviously increases the chances that it comes to the top of the pile. So I would encourage you to do that at some point when I'm speaking. You can do it now, but the code will appear on every slide I'm going through, so you've got a few opportunities to do that. Okay, so let's begin. So what I'm going to do, start off to a little bit about COVID and obviously Omicron, which is an issue that has arisen since we've closed the forecast. Talk a bit about just the budget, the 22-23 budget, which is the main focus for many of you, but also, as David said, I think the thing that we've looked at specifically this time around for various reasons is the longer term outlook, so the 5-year outlook. So I'll talk a bit about the economy, tax and social security, and what that means in overview for the fiscal position of Scotland. Okay, so starting with the health warning. So as I mentioned just now, our forecast was closed really before Omicron had arisen as an issue, and therefore our assumptions were that although clearly there would be continuing concern about COVID, that another wave was not on the way. So the situation has already changed a bit from what we expected in our forecast. Now, I think if we were to do the forecasting today, probably what we would do is have a slightly weaker quarter this quarter, and indeed a slightly weaker quarter in Q1 next year. But I don't think at this point we would say that the forecast, particularly the longer term forecast, would be significantly affected. Now, clearly Omicron is a developing situation and could become more important. But at the moment, given the restrictions that have already been announced and the sort of expectations that are currently being discussed, we would see this as maybe slightly weakening the short-term outlook compared to what we have, but not really the long-run story, which is the one we're going to focus on today. But it's clearly the downside risk is higher than when we completed the forecast. So let me start with the 22-23 budget. So this table, there's a lot going on in this table, so I'll attempt to take it relatively slowly. So this compares the 21-22 budget with the 22-23 budget. And it breaks things up particularly into the two groupings: resource, which is sort of current spending versus capital spending. So starting on resource, the first line, as you can see, shows you the block grant funding coming from the UK government, and you can see that significantly increases from 21-22 to 2023. However, the second line sort of shows you something of a different story in the sense that 21-22 there was almost 5 billion of COVID funding, which is not in this year's numbers. And as you can see, that more than offsets the increase in the block grant that we have there. So overall, resource spending, when we get to the bold line at the bottom, is actually slightly lower 22-23 than it was in 21-22, and that's really a result of the end of that COVID funding. That's the key factor. The other key thing I wanted to highlight from the resource side is really this 742 number, the other funding. Other is always a sort of, ends up being an interesting category. As you can see, that is significantly higher than 21-22, and it includes 620 million of funding that we is sort of risk. Risky is a slightly extreme way of putting it. Is not clear in a sense. It's a judgment of whether this money will come. So this includes extra money from resource estimates coming in February, from the next UK fiscal event, from a resolution of a dispute about spillovers that has been ongoing for some time, and from leases for offshore wind. So those sources, we've judged that the estimates that the government's come up with are reasonable in the sense of the overall extra funding that it is could turn up. But I think we want to highlight that that is not a certain sort of funding, and therefore if any one of those falls behind, or indeed if they fall behind overall, that will have put pressure on the cottage budget. And of course, as we'll come to at the end of this slide, if it was significantly greater than that, the extra funding, oddly enough, that does also cause problems with the Scottish budget, because there is a limited ability in the fiscal framework for Scotland to put aside windfalls funding. So either way, the riskiness of some of that funding could put some pressures on the budget. So that's the resource side, as I say, slightly low, as you can see overall. Capital side, really the same story. There you can see the block funding, grant funding is falling, and we'll see how that's a trend that we're going to see going forward over the next 5 years. And as a result, total capital funding is slightly lower in 22-23. And so you can see, if we took a look at the overall budget, and there are obviously different ways of calculating this number, and you may have seen some different numbers, but in the way we calculate it for the total budget, we see a fall in nominal terms of 2.6% in the budget, and that translates to a 5.2% fall in real terms. So something of a squeeze on the budget. Okay, so what's happening on the policy side? So there have been a few policy announcements. So on the tax side, the higher rate of income tax was frozen, the threshold was frozen. So that means more people are paying the higher rate, and that delivers extra revenue, as you can see, over the whole period. Offsetting that, there is the hospitality relief on NDR that's going to cost something in the coming year. That's for the first 3 months of this year. And similarly, the NDR poundage has been fixed, and that will also reduce revenue. But overall, as you can see, a slight increase in revenue from the frozen higher rate thresholds. The bigger numbers come on the Social Security side, where there are a number of things. Now, one of the first of which, adult disability payment, which regular viewers will know is actually something we discussed in detail in August, but obviously it's important for the budget, so we're repeating it here. What is happening there is that's being transitioned to being run by the Scottish Government, and the Scottish Government is slightly changed the parameters of that payment, but the thing that will be a significant change, we feel, is that the Scottish Government is committed to really helping on take-up, so trying to be more supportive and helpful to applicants, and we suspect that will result in a significant increase in the take-up of this payment, and that's why we see these very large numbers, obviously particularly towards the end of the forecast period, coming through on that. A more recently announced policy, the Scottish Child Payment rising to £20. That's a relatively easy calculation to do. So that's the numbers there. And in fact, I should go back to the adult disability payment in a sense, although the child payment is a relatively easy calculation, this has been quite a difficult one. So the adult disability payment forecast is, as you might imagine, subject to significant uncertainty, because we're trying to guess behaviour of applicants and indeed of Social Security Scotland. So we will put a bit of a warning around that. We've done our best to allow for those effects, but that is quite a difficult forecast to do when you're trying to judge how applicants will feel about a different way of running the system. And then there's some small other measures here. But what you can see overall is, particularly as you get to the end of the 5-year period, the Social Security spend is a significant amount, and I'll return to that in a bit. Okay, so now the 5-year outlook. As David mentioned, certainly compared to what we expected in January last year, the economy is doing a lot better than we expected, and that's to do partly because of the vaccine rollout and how that progressed, and that was much faster and much more effective than we initially anticipated. But also that we saw that actually the Scottish economy and the UK economy became better at dealing with COVID, being able to run under the restrictions, and that's sort of an important message to think about with Omicron, that if restrictions do return, it seems that the economy has become a bit more flexible than it was certainly in the first wave of COVID in terms of managing any restrictions that are imposed. But overall, as you can see, a significantly better economic outlook. And in terms, as well as saying that the short-run effect of the pandemic is less than we expected, the other thing that we've done is, relative to January, we expect the long-run effect, the scarring effect. So you can see that the difference between the yellow and the blue lines here to be less. So the long-run impact of COVID we expect to be less than we did in January. Okay, so where do we stand relative to other forecasters? I would say, given the uncertainties that we're living with in the current times, these forecasts are actually remarkably close together, and we are pretty much aligned with the average, maybe on the lower side, but certainly not that's not an extreme sense. And so we have 3.8% growth in 2022 compared to 4.8 for the Fraser calendar, and the OBR has 6, although as I say, that's really not, given what's been going on, is not a huge difference. So this is in period. Another area where things have done a lot better than we expected is in the labour market. So as you can see, the light blue line was our expectation in January. We thought a significant labour market effect on unemployment. What we've seen is not only has the furlough scheme proved very effective, but what has been remarkable is as that scheme is unwinding, it really has had limited effect on unemployment. And I think everybody's been surprised about how well that's progressed. So we see a little uptick in unemployment, but really way less than I think we and others were anticipating. That's shown itself to be relatively robust to those COVID restrictions. Okay, the news today, inflation. So this is our inflation forecast for higher numbers, as you might expect, given recent history. Today's number was even higher than most expected, but it was only 1 month's number, and we're really interested in the long run effects. So, and in particular, the September inflation number is a key one for Social Security. So, even though inflation for the most current number has been a bit higher than I think most expected, I don't think that's a reason to think that we need to revisit the whole forecast just on the basis of 1 month's number. So I think we're still relatively comfortable with this forecast, but clearly inflation is another thing that is uncertain at the moment. Okay, so let's have a look at that 5-year outlook in terms of revenues, and this really is one of the messages, key messages we try to bring out in the report, is these tax and net positions. So if I try and sort of explain what those are, basically the way the block grant works is that you in a sense, Scotland would get its share of UK-wide tax revenue. However, under devolution, income tax is now measured at Scotland level, so we have the revenue from Scotland itself. And so what happens is that the Scottish share of UK-wide is taken away from the block grant and replaced with what is genuinely seen to be Scottish tax revenue. And the thing we wanted key thing to highlight on that number, particularly 22-23, as you can see, is that position goes negative. So in a sense, what we're seeing is that the amount of tax revenue generated in Scotland, as far as we can judge, is actually less than the UK-wide share that it would get under the block grant. So it's that's meaning that in a sense there's less revenue around for Scotland than there would have otherwise have been. And as you can see in that position, particularly, well, I would highlight only really a couple of years out, we can see that position remains. I think going further out is problematic. So I wouldn't necessarily highlight those numbers in the out years so much. But as you can see, there's negative tax position from income tax. Now that's somewhat offset, particularly by buildings transactions tax, where because the Scottish tax system is slightly more progressive, the run up in house prices in particular we've seen over the last few years generates more revenue for Scotland than the UK-wide share of tax revenue. Landfill tax, well, that's a relatively small item, but it's generally positive apart from when the BMW ban comes in right at the end of the forecast. So overall, as you can see, those net positions, although they vary, you can see they are generally moving into a negative area, and that's in some sense a constraint on the Scottish budget. Now that net position is, in a sense, maybe slightly surprising because, as you know, the Scottish tax system is actually has higher tax rates than the equivalent UK one. So in a sense, the Scottish government has, admittedly in relatively small amounts, has raised tax rates for Scottish citizens, and therefore you might expect that the net position will be positive. However, what's been going on, and I'll explain where these numbers come from in a second, where this negative trend has come from in a second. But as you can see, that although the increase in tax rates did begin to create a positive position, the light blue line is showing our estimate of what would have happened if those tax rates hadn't been changed. And as you can see, the net position would have been negative and trending downwards throughout, even starting right at the beginning of in 2017-18. So in a sense, the fact that the position has gone negative in this budget is saying that the rise in tax rates we've seen so far in Scotland has actually been offset by this downward trend in revenues, Scottish revenues, over the period, and that's obviously makes the Scottish budget more difficult to handle. So what explains that downward trend in the net position on income tax? Well, there's two main stories. The first one, probably less important, but it's worth highlighting, and this chart sort of highlights it. So this shows you the regional growth in earnings. Now, it's a pretty small window, February 20 to September 21. So I think different windows would show slightly different stories, but the general story will be the same. And what you can see is the key story on the regional side is northeastern Scotland has had the weakest earnings growth. And that really is explained by the fact that the oil sector has done relatively poorly. So there's been a negative drag on that region from oil, which obviously historically has been a big earning area for that part of Scotland. So that's one story that explains that downward trend in tax revenue, that the oil is downward trending as well. However, what you can see if you look at the other regions that we've got on here, which are all in yellow, is that all of the regions of Scotland are actually below the UK average on this particular window I'm looking at. So that says this is not, oil is not the whole story by any means. There is a Scotland-wide story going on here as well. So oil is a contributory factor, but not the whole story. And as far as we can see, although there are potentially other elements of the story, the key other element is the divergence in labour market participation between Scotland and the UK. So this is the share of the population actually working or participating in the labour market. So what we see there is two factors that drive this divergence between the UK and Scotland. The first one is the demographics of the older population. So there are more older people in Scotland, and therefore their moving into leaving the labour market is having a bigger effect than the equivalent group in the rest of the UK. So we're just seeing that as a pure demographic effect, that the fact that there is that older population, or higher share of older population in Scotland, and their labour market behaviour is to obviously more likely to be not participating in the labour market. The other factor is lower youth participation in Scotland. It's not clear why that's happening, but that has been an important factor in driving that divergence. So both at that old age level, but also youth participation in the labour market in Scotland is lower. And as you can see, that divergence really becomes quite large, about 3% difference in participation by the end of the forecast, and that's what's really driving that lower tax revenue, because obviously people are not participating in the labour market, they're not going to be paying tax to the same extent. Okay, so now on the social security side, so we've talked a bit about this already, but just to give you the long run picture. So this is quite a complicated slide, but there's really two key stories from it. The first is just the growth in the social security budget over time. So as you can see, 22-23, we're looking at 4.1 billion of spending. By 26-27, we're talking about 5.5 billion. So a big increase in the size of that budget over time. The other thing to highlight is that the changes in color, I guess, is important. So the blue slices are social security that is controlled by Scottish government policy. The yellow is controlled by UK government policy. So as you can see, we move from less than a quarter being under Scottish government policy control to almost 3/4. Indeed, it is entirely possible actually by the time we get to 26-27, the whole of this pie chart will be blue, but on currently announced policies, we're looking at about 3/4 being Scottish government run. And as you can see, as we've talked about already, the really big ticket item there is the move from personal independence payment, which is a UK run policy, to adult disability payment, which is a Scottish government policy, and that's about half of the total budget just by itself. So that's the big element of that spending. Okay, but talking about the other policy that's been announced, the Scottish child payment. So as you know, the amount has been raised. The other thing that's been going on is that the number of children eligible to receive this has risen. Now that's a bunch of different things. So if you look at the second little group of people over here, you can see that the current policy is the blue children. The big increase in terms of the yellow children here is that it'll be extended from the under 6 to the 16, up to age 16. So clearly that significantly increases the number of children eligible to receive this, or families receive this. So that's the big increase we see in the number of children. The next one, these two little smaller areas are important. First of all is the children. That's because of the changes to universal credit, particularly on the taper, which means that there are more families who get the universal credit and therefore more qualify for the child payment. And so that's most of the blue, but also I think some people will actually apply, there'll be more interest of the universal credit when the child payment rises. And the final grey child here at the end is what we expect as higher take up of the benefit, that as the amount offered goes up, people who may not have realised it existed or may not have had the time to apply will be more incentivized to apply when the amount goes up. So we expect a higher take up to occur as well. So as you can see, Scottish child payment becomes a pretty significant part of the budget as well. So that now we're going to look at, in a sense, doing the same we did with on the tax side with the social security side. So this is the same sort of calculation on the net position. So social security spending relative to the block grant funding, and as you can see, those are very negative. So you see the first line is really this adult disability payment effect that I've already discussed, that we expect the focus on giving a better service to applicants will result in a significant increase in spending on that benefit. There's also obviously new payments, that includes shuttles as well. Those will increase spending above the block grant, since there isn't a block grant for those Scottish-specific spending. And therefore, we have a total increase in spending above the block grant, which rises significantly over the horizon. And indeed, I think our thought is that, if anything, this is a conservative estimate for a number of reasons. One technical one to do with how we've calculated the ADP effect, but one just more general one is that there are more policies, I wouldn't say commitments, but more policy ideas out there for social haven't yet been implemented, and so if those are implemented, that will increase the budget on Social Security in its own right. So, as I say, if anything, this is a conservative estimate of the total increase. So that's the picture. So you can see that, in a sense, the big message we have there is that net position, so that the tax side not looking as good as one might hope. The Social Security spending side looking much higher, and that will mean that the budget will need careful management over the next 5 years. There's those two things are going to be difficult to manage simultaneously: that lower tax revenue and rising Social Security spending. Okay, so let's have a look a bit more at the 5-year outlook. So this is the resource spending, the thing that we looked briefly at the beginning, but it's going over a longer period. And as you can see, that the funding for the next few years is basically flat. So if we take 22-23 as 100, 23-24 is in real terms still 100, and indeed about 24-25 in real terms. So in real terms, flat for the next couple of years. And although it'll rise in the out years, those rises are relatively small. Obviously, in nominal terms, including inflation, there is a rise, but the real movements are the key ones here. So not a big increase in resource funding. Capital funding, as I mentioned, that is actually looking to fall significantly, both in nominal and real terms. So that's to do with the funding from the UK government falling over that period. So we are going to see a significant fall in the capital budget over the 5-year horizon. Finally, an old favourite, although quite a complicated one, reconciliation. So this is a little bit complicated, but I will try and explain it. So the way that the Scottish budget works is that, as I mentioned before, it really ends up comparing the UK-wide, Scottish share of the UK-wide tax revenue, which comes through the block grant, with the actual revenue that Scotland raises in Scotland. Now, in a given year, when the budget is made, neither of those numbers are actually available. We don't actually know how much tax has been raised over the whole UK, and we don't know how much tax has been raised in Scotland. So the way it works is that our forecasts of Scottish tax revenue is used, as well as the OBR's forecasts of the BGA is used. So we have two. So basically, when the budget is set, it's set on the basis of two forecasts. Now, eventually, we get to see the real data, and that doesn't really happen until a few years later, as you can see. And when we get the real data, there is a process called reconciliation. In effect, if Scotland has received more money than it should have done, it has to pay it back, and vice versa if it's received less money than it should have done. And so that's what these reconciliations do. Now, that lengthy explanation just leads me to focus on this final bar here, which is our current forecasts for the 24-25 reconciliation. So we don't know what the reconciliation will be, but we have our expectation it will be relatively large, because there was a timing difference between the two forecasts, between the OBR forecast and our forecast, which resulted in the two forecasts being somewhat different. And so we're looking at currently expecting a -469 reconciliation, so money that Scotland will need to pay in 24-25 to do with the extra revenue or the excess revenue they received in 21-22. Now again, that's still indicative, so that number is not certain yet, but I think we want to highlight it because it is A, a large number, and B, it will be difficult to think of that sort of order. And the reason it'll be difficult to manage, or one of the reasons it'll be difficult to manage, is that, as most of you know, the fiscal framework doesn't allow Scotland that much ability to transfer funds between years. So basically, it's almost has to balance its budget every single year. There's a little bit of leeway, but effectively there's a limited ability to transfer between years. So when you have a big number like -469 on the horizon, you might think, oh well, let's save up in order to pay it. But if in fact the framework doesn't really give you much guidance, and indeed you might say, oh well, we'll borrow that year to tide us over that one-off reconciliation. But again, the framework doesn't give you that much room to do that. And indeed, what is slightly awkward about the number for 24-25 is actually the flexibility to transfer money across years will actually be reduced on that particular year, just on that very year when that big number comes along. So what's been happening between 21, 22, 23, 24 is that the Scottish Government Centre have benefited from what's called a Scottish specific economic shock, which was during the COVID pandemic. Scotland, in a particular period, underperformed the UK, and it was really just a timing issue, but it underperformed enough to trigger part of the fiscal framework mechanism that gave Scotland a bit more flexibility to transfer money between years. And you can see it could borrow up to 600 as a result of that. And it could draw down its bank account as much as it wanted. By the time that very big reconciliation turns up, the borrowing limit will go back down to its normal level of 300, which, as you can see, is less than 469. So it can't just use borrowing to that. And the drawdown on the reserve will be capped on the resource side at 250 million. And indeed, in practice, that 250 million is almost all used up with just normal management of departmental spending. So what will happen is that if the number is as big as 469 as we project, it will be quite a lumpy amount of money for the budget to manage, and it could cause some reshuffling to be required in order to manage that. So that not as big a sort of long run trend risk as the net positions I discussed, but it is going to be a one-off tricky issue that will have to be managed when it arises. Okay. So I've gone through a great deal there, so hopefully I haven't completely lost everybody on all those issues, but certainly either if you didn't understand me or you disagreed or indeed you want to agree, it's time now for questions and answers. And just to remind you, that's the Slido question that you put your questions into slido.com, and that's the code for doing that. So I'll hand back to David.
Thank you, Francis, for that very interesting and thorough presentation. So it's now time for the panel, myself, Francis, Claire, and David, to answer your questions, which I'm glad to say have been flowing in through Slido. So the first question is, so it hasn't quite come up yet.
Do you want me to jump in, David? I've got the question here.
We'll have you. Okay, it's not shown up on mine. Okay.
Okay. The first question is, I think it might have been passed to me anyway. It's on the Scottish economy. So from Andy Bell, what particular sectoral growth in the Scottish economy is likely to best address and reverse the forecast income tax decline over the next 5 years? Obviously a really important question given everything that Francis was saying. Francis highlighted the oil and gas sector. Historically, that's been a very high income sector and contributed quite a bit to the Scottish economy and to Scottish earnings. With the fall in oil prices in 2014 and sort of the maturing of the North Sea as an industry, that industry is now exerting a negative pressure on Scottish earnings, and in particular with the highest earners in that sector contributing the most to Scottish tax revenues in the past. As those incomes sort of decline and disappear from Scotland, that has quite a big effect on tax revenues. So that's one important sector, but of course how much is it possible to reverse that change, and how much is it even desirable to, given targets of net zero? So that's one tricky question for the Scottish Government. Another area that we look at in our report is the strength of the financial industry. So Scotland does have a strong financial services industry, but in London and the southeast of England, the financial services have been really booming over the last couple of years, and that's important too. So it's an issue to look at what's happening with financial services in Scotland as well, and is that industry changing in Scotland, and why is there some divergence there? But I think it's also really important, as Francis said in its slides, the sort of sectoral story is important, but actually it's the employment and demographic effects, which don't have as much to do with the sectoral mix, which are having a big influence on this divergence as well. So there's lots of different factors there to be looked at.
Okay, thank you, David. Okay, we have another question from Murdo Fraser. Do you have any observations on why unemployment is significantly lower now than was previously being predicted when furlough came to an end? Well, I'll start off on this, but I'll hand over to David in a minute. But I think there's two factors going on here. One was that because the economy was growing a lot more quickly than we thought, a lot of people actually came off furlough back into employment before the job support scheme actually came to an end. So the number of people transitioning from furlough back into employment was much lower. But also, as you know, we've had a big growth in vacancies in the economy. There have been job shortages in various sectors. So even if people could not get employed in the sector in which they were previously employed, there were other opportunities for employment out there. So, David, have I missed anything?
I was just going to add that sort of a year ago, we were talking about particularly higher income households were able to save a lot of money during the lockdown and during the early stages of the pandemic. And the question was, how quickly would they start spending that money again as restrictions lifted? And I think what we've seen is that they did start to spend that money. Demand in the economy was a lot stronger than expected. And rather than rising unemployment, the rise in demand was so strong that we've actually been struggling to fill vacancies instead. So,
yeah, and I thought I might add, although the labour market as a whole has performed very well, there is still a degree of mismatch. So in the sense that not everybody's in the right job, sort of thing. Although there are lots of people are in jobs, and that's one of the reasons why these supply chain issues are coming up. Is that we're still adjusting, partly because spending patterns have changed, and obviously partly because the economy structure has changed. So although there has been a sort of reshuffling into jobs, there's more to come, in the sense that I think there's still a degree of mismatch out there.
Okay. Another question is, in light of the First Minister's COVID announcement yesterday, how will these additional restrictions affect your forecast for the economy and the budget? So I'll start off on this one. So in terms of the economy, as Francis said in his presentation, we expect there will be some impact maybe in Q4 this year and in the first quarter of next year. But we don't expect at the moment that there will be a longer term impact on the economy. In terms of the budget, as Francis mentioned in his talk, the income tax figures that go into the budget for next year, both our forecasts of tax revenue and the OBR's forecasts of the block grant adjustment, those have already been fixed by our forecasts. So that won't have any impact. If there is a downturn in income, it won't affect the budget next year. But it could have an impact 3 or 4 years down the line if there's a reconciliation coming along. In terms of Social Security, it could be if there was a hit to income, there could be more people eligible for universal credit, and that's a qualifying benefit for many other benefits in Scotland. But I think that effect is likely to be relatively small. And remember, the big spending here is on adult disability benefit, which is not really affected by economic performance. So the only other elements of the budget are any adjustments to block grants. As we heard yesterday, there's been some announcement that the UK government will be increasing the amount of block grants given to Scotland. particularly as a consequential of the increased booster program that's being rolled out on health. But Claire, do you want to add any more about what would be happening on the block grant front?
Yeah, so the UK government announced yesterday there'd be additional funding, but they haven't confirmed yet how much. So ordinarily, the Scottish Government would find out about any additional funding at supplementary estimates, which will be in February. They've said they'll bring forward the announcement to inform the Scottish Government earlier, which is helpful for the government, but the final amount won't be confirmed until February. So we're a little bit back in the same space that we were last year, that the government's managing its spending, its public health policy, which might have spending implications, against a sort of slightly uncertain budget where the level of funding they're getting from the UK government is unclear. So I think we talked about that quite a lot last year, and this in our forecast this time we've more focused on the 5-year perspective. But it seems with the development of Omicron, we're unfortunately back in the same space again that we were last year, and the government managing this budget in a pretty challenging situation.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Okay, another question we've got is, does the forecast income trajectory, i.e. negative tax income, increased social security spending, etc., cast doubt on the economic argument for independence? I think, David, you want to kick off with something on this?
Well, this is a tricky question, obviously, and independence is about more than just tax revenues. But one point I will make is, we make a 5-year forecast for thinking about independence. You'd be looking over much longer horizons. One really interesting question for me is in what we've been looking at here is how much of this is a shorter term cyclical effect and how much of it is sort of structural and baked into the Scottish economy. I think the reality, it will be a mixture of the two. And that's something that I think we want to look at in a little more detail. So, it's entirely possible that within, the next 5 to 10 years, you'll see this position move in a different direction. And that's something that, we want to think a bit more about.
Okay, thanks very much. So we have another question. What in your view are the things that need to change in the fiscal framework to limit as much as possible the negative pressures on future Scottish budgets? I think, Francis, that's very much in your territory.
Well, so that's a hospital pass. But anyway, yes, it's first and foremost, obviously, we have nothing to say about the fiscal framework itself. That's not our remit. So we operate within the fiscal framework. But I think, as you can see from the slides we're looking at, it's a difficult situation because the budget's getting bigger, both inflation and real terms, and yet the limits that between year transfers are fixed in money terms. And so that situation I discussed, the minus 469 being bigger than the borrowing limit, is going to be a more common occurrence as the budget gets bigger. And I will leave it there because I say that doesn't lead to necessarily to conclusion, but it does highlight that there are that things don't stand still, that a framework that cannot be set in stone.
Okay, David or Claire, do you want to add anything to that?
I'll just add, as Francis has said, there's political choices in terms of how the framework is set, and we will leave that entirely to the politicians. And I think all we're doing is showing how the current framework operates and what the effect is. And as Francis has said, there's certain things around the way the limits for borrowing and the Scotland Reserve work that do affect the government's choices and its ability to manage some of this. And we're highlighting that, and that I understand will be part of the fiscal framework negotiations, which are due to start next year.
Okay, thank you. Okay, another question from Susan Murray is, does the adult disability payment projection include an increase for the number of people living with the life-limiting health conditions as a result of COVID? Claire, do you want to maybe start off on that one?
I can do, yeah. So in our forecast in January for the budget, well, it's the current year budget. I keep wanting to say last year, but obviously having done a budget in January and then another one in December, they're in the same year. So in the last budget, we included an adjustment in our PIP and ADP forecast for an assumption that more people would be affected as a result of COVID, and that was a combination of things. Some was as a direct result of people who had contracted COVID and had health implications of that. There's also the fact that some people have been unable to access healthcare or delayed access to healthcare. And then finally, also the sort of mental and physical repercussions of the lockdown periods that we've had. So we included an adjustment in our forecast in January to account for that. And at that point, we thought that would add about £70 million a year to adult disability or PIP spending each year. We have slightly changed the adjustment that we've made in these forecasts just because we haven't seen quite the same inflows that we would have expected as a result of that. So we now assume that we'll still see those inflows, but it will take another couple of years. So there is an adjustment for that in our forecast, and we will see how that emerges. I should add that the OBR make a very similar assumption in their forecast of spending in England and Wales as well. So therefore, there is funding for that because it will come through the block grant adjustment, assuming that there is a similar degree of number of people who receive it in England, Wales and in Scotland. So there's a sort of funding position there.
Okay, but just two important corollaries on that. One is it makes the point that what's driving certainly disability payment is nothing really to do with the economy. It's these other health factors. Of course, that will have an impact on the economy as well, but it's not really driven by the performance of the economy. And the other big point here is that, going back to, as Francis said, to the fact that you're accounting for £3 billion in adult disability payment at the end of the period. So even small adjustments that you make to include people with COVID or long COVID end up having very large impacts on the sums of money involved. You've got tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, that get involved in that. Okay, I want to go back now to issues to do with the labour market. So I've got a question from Reese Harper. The labour market participation rate for young people looks very concerning. What was the Commission's definition of young? I.e., what were the age thresholds? David, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I was just looking it up when the question came in. So this is referring to figure 3.12 in our report. It's on page 56. Delighted to say that the definition of young that we've used is 16 to 34. So I can just about count myself in that group still. But I think, there's an important point here because we've actually seen slower labour market participation growth among people aged 35 to 54 as well in Scotland. So it's probably more particular to younger people, but there is slower labour market participation growth among several age groups within Scotland as well. And that's clearly an important issue to think about.
Okay. Francis, do you want to add anything more to that?
Well, I'd just say that, as I discussed in the slide, there are two effects. There's the aging population and this youth one. And the aging one is sort of mechanical. You can probably project it out for 20, 30 years and see it in the data because that sort of process is slow moving and quite predictable. The youth participation is a bit more of a mystery and a bit more difficult to predict how it will develop. So that's a really important area that I think needs more work. Is this a long run trend, in which case clearly it has a big implication, or is it just a temporary feature? I mean, as David was mentioning before, these are the really important questions to think about for the Scottish budget.
Okay. We have another question, which is, do you plan on evaluating the assumptions the government has made within the other funding line? I think this is the 620 million that you referred to, Francis, in your talk. I'll just say a brief word on this and I'll hand over to Claire. So in our report, we did say that we were expecting the Scottish Government to update us on developments in these lines of funding and keep us informed as to how much of this funding was actually materialising. I don't think we'll evaluate it in the sense of asking questions about why they did it. We will simply be doing our job of tracking the funding as it comes in. Claire, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I suppose, we asked a number of questions in terms of reaching a decision that it was reasonable for the government to include this in their forecast. And that's part of the reason for it. We include, there's a whole page in our report dedicated to this this part of the budget. And that's really to show that I think it is important that the government is transparent about assumptions they make in how their budget is funded, and that we are questioning those assumptions and reaching our own judgment on them. And it really is a judgment that is balanced across the 4 income sources the government have identified. We also noted in our report that the government hadn't identified any underspends from the current financial year, and that was also part of our reaching that judgment. It's probably worth saying, in light of the announcement yesterday from the government that they'd sort of allocated a remaining part of the budget to supporting the hospitality sector and the self-isolation payments, that assumption of no underspend might prove to be more realistic than we perhaps thought at the time we were writing our report. But it was a factor in our judgment. I don't know, Francis, if you want to add anything else.
No, I think you really summed it up. I guess, as I tried to give you the idea in the talk, I mean, we had some sympathy for the Scottish Government position here, because there's, as I said, they can't underestimate the revenue from these sources, and they can't overestimate them either. So they do have to make, they can't get away from having to make a guess on those numbers, or a projection on those numbers, I should say. And we thought that projection was reasonable, but it is difficult, because it's not as if they can say, oh, well, let's be cautious and let's put in a small number, because that will just result in a windfall which they won't have anywhere to put. So it is that is why I think one of the reasons why I think it's reasonable to have a projection which is sort of your best guess of what the number will be.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have another question, again about the fiscal framework. Are you optimistic the fiscal framework review will result in amendments so Scotland is able to better manage year-to-year fluctuations? I think one point to make here before I hand over to others is that some of the things we're trying to point out in our report is that Scotland is facing long-run challenges in managing the budget, and it's not clear that the fiscal framework is the right way of managing these long-run trends out there. To manage those, the Scottish Government will have to plan ahead and start thinking about what priorities it will want to give to various lines of spending, and also to what tax measures it might want to take as well. So some of these long-run pressures are not really year-to-year fluctuations. These are really long-run trends. Claire, do you want to add anything to that?
I think only that I wouldn't like to predict the outcome of a political negotiation. And I suppose to say just that the Commission is ready to offer sort of technical assistance. We do this analysis and include it as part of our report to stay strictly neutral on all matters of the fiscal framework, but we're pointing out, I suppose, how the current arrangements work. Okay,
thank you. Okay, I think we have to be the final question about the economy. Why is Scotland's economy recovering more slowly than the UK? Is it sectoral difference, demographic difference? Do you expect the Scottish economy to catch up? I'll just say one thing briefly, and I think I'll hand over to David on this. So I think the important thing here is that there are a lot of different factors at work here. We pointed to a number of different factors, say on driving earnings. So there's the participation rate, there is the growth in earnings per se. We do see that the northeast of Scotland, which used to be always thought of as being the high income part of Scotland, that's seen the lowest growth rate in incomes because of the impact on North Sea oil, on onshore activity from that. I think one area where Scotland does struggle compared to the rest of the UK is it seems to be the really high income earners growth in the UK seems to be higher than that of the really high income people in Scotland. That could be a sectoral effect. That could be to do with people working, say, in certain parts of the financial sector, in investment banking, rather than in other sectors. But there could be other factors going on there. It could be the composition of their income. That's mattering as well. And we do intend to next year to do a deeper dive into what's going on and driving some of these income differences between Scotland and the UK. David, do you want to add some more to that?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, this is the £190 million question, isn't it? And there are no absolute answers to this. I suppose just in terms of my own speculation, for the last few decades, we've always seen Scotland performing very much in line with the rest of the UK in terms of its growth, and generally is a fairly high performing region of the UK as well. I think it was someone at the Finance Committee just said yesterday, whenever they look at a table of the regions of Scotland, there's always London in the southeast of England at the top, and then usually Scotland in third place. But the big concern is that what's changed. That's the last few decades you've had the oil and gas industry in Scotland driving incomes and the economy, and with that now in decline, it's possible that will lead to a major structural change in the Scottish economy and its relationship with the rest of the UK economy. But we don't have a complete answer to that yet, but it's certainly one possibility.
Okay, thanks, David. Okay, I'm afraid that's all we have time for in the way of questions. If you have any questions that we haven't been able to answer, please contact us on this email address, info@fiscalcommission.scot, and we will try to reply to you by email as soon as possible. The recording of this event will be available on our YouTube channel in the next couple of weeks. So thank you all for attending and for all your very interesting questions. Goodbye.